Okay, I'm trying to record another video, uh, trying to make it brief again on a rather cold October the 4th evening, whenever this kind of unusual weather comes around, and it is partially the result of the hurricane that came sweeping up the East Coast after it devastated Florida and South Carolina and North Carolina. Um, But this is the kind of thing that always reminds me of the absurdity of the commentators who ascribe all these weather related activities or unusual weather situations to climate change. Of course, it started out as global warming, but they can't use global warming when it's like 50 degrees or 48 degrees on October the 4th, a temperature that is not common in the Philadelphia area or in northeast around middle of the mid-Atlantic. Anyway, so on such a cool evening, after having read all kinds of pretty upsetting stories, uh, some of the upsetting stories are local, meaning in U.S. related, and particularly ones that pertain to one of the doctors who I respect most um, because of his extensive research and many years of serious, uh, as serious as possible scientific work as a doctor, Robert Malone, um, and having read the kind of ridiculous sort of infighting, the kind of arguments that are arising from people that are supposedly against the mass psychosis, which he uh, has very appropriately taken over from other uh, quite qualified psychiatrists. Desnos is the guy who is the most well known. I think I got his name right. Anyway, he's a European psychiatrist, and he wrote a book on the phenomena of um, masses of people going along with totally absurd and ridiculous and unsupportable uh, ideas that develop into a psychosis. And the ones that I'm personally familiar with, partially through my family, are of course Nazism and communism. Nazism, which managed to uh, uh, convince a lot of perfectly decent and not horrible, monstrous people, just ordinary, everyday people in Europe, that somehow the Jews were responsible for all of the horrors that were going on in Europe in the 20th century. And there were lots of terrible things that happened in the 20th century. There's no question about that. But using the scapegoat of the Jews worked for the Nazis. And they managed to convince a lot of people. Now, not everybody, thank God, there were many people in Germany, many people in all parts of Europe that didn't believe it, didn't accept it, went against it, often at the risk of their own lives and their families. But there were masses and masses of people who believed the lies, the distortions, the absurd uh, statements about a group of people that were really no different than they were, especially not since many of the Jews that were the scapegoats were not even very Jewish. Some of them were Christians already, had converted, or their families had converted generations ago, but they were still labeled as carriers of this horrible disease, mental disease that supposedly they spread in Europe. A total absurdity, and yet so many people bought it. And then when I was a kid in Hungary, then the communists were selling the socialist and communist myths about capitalism and about people who made money and about how evil and how unscrupulous and how monsters they were. And there were a lot of people that accepted it. Not everybody again. There were lots and lots of people who didn't accept it. But again, it was very hard to fight against it. It was very hard to resist it. There were many, many people put in jail, people were killed, tortured. All kinds of horrible things happened to people who didn't go along with this new psychosis, the mass psychosis uh, propagated by and instigated by this terrorism that came from Moscow, that was directed by Stalin and his willful cohorts, his servants, his right hand men, the various leaders of the NKVD and so forth. And by the way, of course, Lenin, let's not forget Lenin, who had the Cheka, and Dzerzhinsky, a Polish aristocrat, the scion of a Polish aristocrat. He was became the head of the Cheka and killed many, many people early on in the communist rule. So these things were definitely psychoses. But then what we're suffering from, and this is what Robert Malone says, and says quite rightly, is this psychosis having to do with the so-called pandemic. A pandemic that, in fact, if you look at it, the more carefully people look at it, the more many doctors, many researchers are doing all kinds of research and studies, statistical and medical and otherwise, that showed that it was really nothing but a bad flu. It was a bad flu, and partially, probably one of the reasons for the bad flu was because of the absurd way that it was treated, the way it was handled. Instead of trying to treat it with medications that were available and that some people quickly found out, some doctors quickly found out were useful to prevent serious cases. Instead, there was this great surge to come up with some sort of a vaccine, and then they came up with this thing that wasn't really a vaccine, but was a substitute for a vaccine, and succeeded in causing more trouble and more problems, as now the studies are coming out by the hundreds, by the thousands, the studies that are showing that there are all kinds of problems with the COVID-19 related vaccines, so-called vaccines, all kinds of blood formations, blood clots, all kinds of problems with the functioning of the hearts of young, healthy people, various problems with female sexual reproduction and pregnancy, problems with male sexual performance. So all kinds of horrible stories are coming out that are based again on research. I mean, these people are doing research on cases. They look at the number of people that died, and then look at the bloods of the people that died, and they look at the people that were inoculated, and they look at the number of people that were uninoculated versus the number of people that weren't inoculated. So all of these, and you can look at them. There are hundreds and hundreds of these studies. All you have to do is go on the internet and take the time to look at them. And yet, what is happening is people like Robert Malone, who, as a professional, had the nerve. He was one of the few. Actually, there were quite a few, because there in the beginning there were large groups of doctors, 5,000, and then now there's 17,000. So there were lots of doctors that didn't go along with it. But of course, the ones that went along with it because they had to, otherwise they would have lost their jobs. We have to remember that, especially in the United States healthcare system has now turned into a series of huge medical establishments. We're talking about medical establishment the size of which nobody could have imagined 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Institutions like the University of Pennsylvania Medical Establishment here in Philadelphia, and Jefferson Hospital's medical establishment, and all kinds of other ones. There are lots of other ones. It's not those are not the only two. The mainline healthcare is another one, and there are others. Okay, these institutions are huge corporations making enormous amounts of money, and they are the ones that are establishing or taking over the established uh, line provided by the bureaucrats from the NIH or the World Health Organization, all these bureaucratic institutions that instead of relying on the give and take and the arguments in science and allowing those to reach a point where some sort of an approximation to the truth can be at least proposed, these institutions decide at some point that the truth is this, and then they mandate it. And that's sort of the basis of all this psychosis. It drives people. There are people that are 100% convinced and believe that if they don't wear those masks, they will start getting infected and infect other people. It's not true. All of the evidence, all of the new findings have shown that the masks are totally useless unless you have the N95 masks that are only basically used in hospitals now. They're totally useless. They don't do anything to stop infections. But there are people that have to wear them. People in various places. You go in and they wear them. Oh, I have to wear them because a lot of people come in here. Yes, yeah, a lot of people come here, but you don't understand that has nothing to do with you getting infected. The reason you get infected has all kinds of other scientific sources, but not you wearing a mask or not wearing a mask. Anyway, so this is one of the things that is terrible. Then the other part, and this is more of a political, international political thing, is this whole conflict in the Ukraine between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and of course in the background, the United States and the European Union, who is sort of going along with the U.S. not particularly clear leadership. There's nothing clear about any of the leadership that's been provided by this particular administration, and then it's many levels of progressive cohorts who know very little about anything that they touch. They are political animals that have no understanding of reality, or if their understanding of reality is so twisted that you might as well be in something like virtual reality. As far as they're concerned, they are the representatives of a kind of virtual reality that God save us from. Anyway, so here in this conflict, the most recent thing is this blowing up of the pipeline in the Baltic. And the real question is, nobody knows who did it. Okay, everybody, the ones on the one side, the Russians say it's the Americans, and there are lots of people in Europe who believe that the Americans somehow or other, the American great financial institutions are controlling the world and the country. They are behind it. Well, I don't know. I don't know to what degree it would be in their interest, and how they could actually achieve it. Of course, the U.S. military, the U.S. Navy has the capability, but that the U.S. Navy would do something like that, again, the possibility exists. I don't have the information to know it. But the questions are so many that nobody has the answers to them. And then, of course, the other side is that they're saying that the Russians did it. Well, the Russians, again, it's very, very strange to think that the Russians would blow up pipelines that they were involved in building and that they made a lot of money on for a while. Well, the second Nord Stream pipeline was never opened because then the war started, so that never got used. But the other one was used, and it was providing a lot of money to the Russians and a lot of gas to the Europeans. So again, that the Russians blew it up, it's again a little bit of a stretch, to say the least. And then the third thing that the Ukrainians don't even have the technology. How could they do it unless somehow or other somebody who had the technology hired them. And again, that's so here we are guessing, all kinds of guesses, and we have no way of knowing why it happened and how it happened. But the the smart talking heads on various sources, whether they're television or YouTube or anything else, they're talking about how it's the beginning of the Third World War. The Third World War is around the corner. The Russians are going to start using nuclear weapons, and so on and so on. Well, hopefully they're wrong. I believe they are. I don't really think that the Russians are going to use nuclear weapons because they know very well that if they use nuclear weapons, then the other side can use nuclear weapons too, and I don't think they want to do that. And also, the Russians are not in the best of situations because the Ukrainians managed to get all these Western weapons that they're able to use against the Russians. They mounted this counteroffensive that seems to have some success, but be careful again. Never take anything exactly the way they tell you, because even though the Ukrainians have had some military successes in the east of their country and regained some of the lost territory, they've lost enormous numbers of people. The number of soldiers that have died, Ukrainian young men who have been drafted in the last couple of months and did not receive enough training and probably don't even have enough weaponry, and they're moved to the front and are thrown in literally to die. That's what has happened. That's how the Ukrainians, with the aid of course of the modern weapons that they were provided to them by the West, but their victories are enormous. They're Pyrrhic victories. Pyrrhic, as in the Roman times, a Pyrrhic victory was one that was won at such great cost that it wasn't worth it. Of course, becomes the definition of almost any kind of military victory because it's always a question of how much is it worth it. Okay, that you win a victory in a war. Anyway, so that's the kind of evening we have, and these are kinds of hair-raising, unpleasant, scary thoughts that have they elicited. I'm hoping and praying as the only recourse that I have. An old man sitting in his study, hoping and praying for his children and his grandchildren and his friends and all of humanity, that somehow or other, somewhere, some sanity will finally overtake this madness, and maybe some divine intervention will stop us from the destructive and suicidal directions in which the world is going, and we will stop attacking each other, stop attacking those people that are the most valuable for our knowledge and understanding of what's going on. Let's hope so.